Elex is a 3D open-world action RPG made by Piranha Bytes and published by THQ Nordic. Piranha Bytes also made Gothic, Gothic 2, Gothic 3, Risen, Risen 2 and Risen 3. And these are going to be names that you are going to hear a few times during this review, alongside the word Elex a few dozen times. Before you get eye cancer, I had to record Elex at 720p at low settings due to severe frame rate issues, but fuck that! Magalan, a planet that is basically Earth, is hit by a comet that destroys modern civilization. The survivors find their world infected with a poisonous substance named Elex, and eventually they start using it for their own purposes.
Can you eat it?
Yes, and the elves do exactly that. They consume Elex, which blocks their emotions in return for strength as they aim for the next step of human evolution under the leadership of the apparently omnipotent hybrid.
Does that mean we can join the bad guys? Great!
Before the elves founded their own faction, they were part of the clerics, a group of high-tech religious fanatics that pray to the god Kalan. They use Elex to improve their technology, but that didn't help them against...
Whoa, wait a second. If the clerics primarily use it for technology, and the elves use it primarily for consumption, then why are the elves the technologically more advanced faction?
The hybrid. The clerics' reliance on technology and their religion didn't help them against the manpower and magic of the berserkers. These old-fashioned warriors desire to turn the Elex-ridden world into a mana-ridden world instead, because forests look prettier than deserts. They also hate technology, except for when they don't. The outlaws of Logan the Duke use Elex to create stim packs, basically drugs that enhance your capabilities. Everything the outlaws do exclusively happens for more profit, even if that means stashing a few bodies in your basement.
So, to summarize, you can join high-tech tin hats, hypocritical LARPers, or backstabbing mercenaries, and your main foe will always be a bunch of emotionless sociopaths. Honestly, that actually sounds pretty awesome.
You have to join one of the three as part of the main quest during Chapter 1, and the fact that all of them move in grey areas is simply great, because... those moral dilemmas aren't integrated well at all in the general gameplay. What is the general gameplay, you ask? Mostly, you explore the world of Magalan on foot with the aid of your jetpack. As part of your exploration, you can climb whatever looks climbable, you can find a shit ton of items, and unlike Gothic 3, the world is filled to the brim and usually rewards thoroughness with weapons or other goodies. You can also go hunting to kill and loot enemies. You can find plenty of interesting locations, and the world was crafted by hand, with a bunch of copy and paste houses, but nothing that would ever ruin your enjoyment. There are thousands of items spread around Magalan, and contrary to Gothic 3, the world is actually complete and offers motivation to explore by adapting a similar world design philosophy as The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. But Elex doesn't reach the same level of quality or comfortability, but its world can still compete with the very best of the action RPG genre. The side quests in Elex are pretty damn good. I will compare the quest design of Elex with a similar game that you're probably familiar with, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. In Witcher 3, the main quests are the ones with the most complexity, while the side quests usually offer different results on an often linear path of getting there. In Elex, you have more freedom of choice during your side quests, while it's often the results that don't vary a lot. This doesn't apply to all side quests, but even smaller side quests offer at least 2 solutions at least. This heavily benefits the replay value. The writing is also closer to what Piranha Bytes used to do, being based on the personalities of the characters that give you the quests, instead of simply shoving the content into Elex for nostalgia's sake. This means that Piranha Bytes managed to craft some really good quests ever since Gothic 2, at least in my opinion. The world building that is conveyed through these side quests is also great, and the world of Magellan has enough backstory to get you thinking and to keep you engaged with the overall events of the game. The amount of different weapons is impressive, and there are more than 45 different weapon types you can use. These are separated into melee and ranged weapons, which also include magic. Every melee weapon category uses different animations depending on whether or not it's a one-handed or two-handed weapon, and whether or not you carry a shield into combat. The Berserkers have the opportunity to craft the best bows, which are also the ranged weapons with the highest amount of damage per projectile, while also being able to utilize their melee skills the best out of all the other guilds.
Hail Kalan, I'm a cleric and everything I do is overpowered.
The Outlaws don't even have a handful of exclusive abilities. The most important stuff is in form of the grenade launchers, Stimpack effectiveness upgrades, salvaging weapons, and the ability to craft your ammunition. The Outlaws are supposed to craft Stimpacks and use them with higher effectiveness, but since you can just outright buy the recipes and craft them yourself, it makes the primary aspect of Outlaw exclusivity pretty pointless. But hey, you can join them the fastest, and if you like to craft things and blow shit up, then it's the perfect guild for you.
I suppose now it's time for those topics. But you know what? I wanna mention one more positive thing, and that is the distance renderer on even the lowest graphics settings. The distance, how far you can see, is really impressive. And for a game that doesn't have AAA budget, it's actually outright amazing. It's not perfect, but still very good.
At first, the world of Magellan is fascinating with its vast deserts, the flourishing forests, and post-apocalyptic destruction. Although at some point, maybe not after your first playthrough, perhaps not even after your second playthrough, but eventually you'll start noticing it.
This is the world of Elex.
The world, unfortunately, starts to fall apart eventually. One part due to the general writing, which suffers from
"It's only my death that would be of consequence, or the death of my enemy, or the death of my enemy."
Where can I find Eric? Who's Alois?
What's happening in the city?
How are the seedlings?
But it will take time to train Oryx's replacement and give them the care they need. And, in the meantime, we have a different problem.
And while not every dialogue has this issue, it will cause you to grow tired of listening to them saying one thing in 5 different ways back to back, or, like in the clip, literally the same thing twice. I also don't enjoy how the writing doesn't always make clear what story event is merely foreshadowing and what is actually relevant to the plot at hand. For example, when you join the Outlaws, You will see signs of an internal power struggle between the Duke and a man called Bloody Baxter. However, you will never meet him because he doesn't exist, and there's nothing in Elex that conveys that information to you. But speaking of information... You cannot see the amount of experience you have, and you can't even see the amount of health you have. Extend this to every enemy, and the numbers become irrelevant to a point where the only thing that matters boils down to higher or lower. So in other words, Elex has a system that wants you to work with numbers, but it doesn't give you the tools to do it. So, to make a long story short, the only way to improve your stats is with new weapons, new armor, temporary effects or permanent potions. Elex utilizes two different mechanics for this as well. With each level up, you gain health points.
Don't ask me how many because I don't have any idea.
10 attribute points and 1 skill point. You use skill points to learn stuff like gutting out animals, casting spells, etc., while you use your attribute points to equip new items and to meet the requirements for the skills.
And this is where Elex starts to slip into the cardinal death sin territory of video game design.
Elex claims that the attributes have an immediate upgrade effect, but that's a goddamn lie. The attributes are merely limiters for skills and new equipment. Same thing with the Elex substance itself. You can consume mana or Elex to raise or decrease your emotional value. However, once converted into potions, they lose most of their side effects to an almost non-existent value. But I can hear you ask, why does this matter in the first place? Your emotional value unlocks dialogue options in both some side quests and many main quests, and a different quest result is usually locked behind one of those unique dialogue options. This wouldn't be much of a problem if it was consistent like in Mass Effect. But like Risen 3, the only thing that is ultimately determined is which one of the two endings you'll get. The endings themselves are actually very similar to Mass Effect 1, as that game also has two major endings with minor variations.
However, I can safely say that this more system is much better than the one of Risen 3. This is due to the possibility of increasing or decreasing your emotional value by consuming raw mana or raw Elex, which traders carry an infinite amount of. However, this is also solely responsible for basically allowing you to gain an endgame build in the first 4 hours.
Which finally brings us to the biggest issue of Elex. The combat system. You start off with melee weapons. With those, you can use normal attack with the left mouse button, you can use a strong attack with the E button, you can use a special attack with the Q key after your combo meter has charged up, and you can block or parry by holding or clicking the right mouse button in the right moment. With ranged weapons, which include all the guns, a lot of the available magic and other weapons like spear slingers, you can shoot projectiles that have different properties, depending on your weapon. You can aim with the right mouse button, which also shortly locks onto the enemy. You shoot with the left mouse button, you reload with the R key, and you can switch up to 2 alternate fire modes with Y and C. The combat is broken and absolute garbage. Yes, it can work, and yes, you can play the game, but that doesn't make this combat system good, enjoyable, or well designed.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I'm going to explain Elex's combat system to you. The first thing we need to do is to take a healthy doses of bugs and glitches and throw it into the shit. Next we need to do is to ignore the playtesting phase. All we need to do for that is to take the game as it currently is and shove it into the shit. And presto! It's the surge.
Let's start with the melee glitches, like the game simply not knowing what to do anymore and you can't do anything except for walk around. But to make a very long story short, enjoy a few clips of the enemy AI jumping into the air and getting stuck. I think you get the idea what kind of combat this is. This combat system can occasionally work and the melee weapons can be really good. For the sole reason that combos with melee weapons do the most amount of damage, but when you look at it from a design and gameplay perspective, then this is definitely the worst combat system that Piranha Bytes has ever designed. Let me show you how every melee battle essentially goes. Depending on the enemy, stun lock the enemy to death by starting with a heavy attack and either keep going with heavy attacks, or do some normal attacks and finish off your stamina meter with this special attack. The only additional melee attack you'll ever get is a jetpack attack, which you could use if you want to.
Guess how long it takes to recharge?
17.5 seconds.
17.5 seconds. Oh, in a single-player action RPG in which so many things are already tedious! Like the ranged combat.
So, if we look past stuff like shotguns that shoot large bolts, something that they have already done better in Risen 2, then we'll eventually encounter a very, very big issue for this third-person shooter. Dear viewers, it is time to introduce you to FSP, Frame Skipping Projectiles. Every time you shoot a projectile, the game will skip some frames of the projectile's travel distance, which can cause it to pop up behind the enemy and miss him completely.
Hey you, give me your stuff!
You are aware that the final patch of Elex broke pretty much as it tried to fix.
God damn it! What the fuck?
Have I mentioned yet that the aiming cursor isn't adjusted correctly and it's just slightly off mark enough so that you won't be able to hit enemies in extremely close combat anymore? For this reason, you should always carry a ranged weapon that deals knockback, so that when you have an emergency, you can just simply shoot the ground to kill the enemy.
But how do you know which one to pick when there are over 40 ways of attacking an enemy?
This is my tier list of all the weapon categories in Elex, including every ranged weapon and every single spell in the game. We start off with the S+ tier, the plasma rifles. These have shots that simply do damage, an alternate fire mode with which each shot deals knockback in an area, and you also get an EMP wave, with which you can stun any mechanically enhanced enemy for a few seconds. A good plasma rifle is everything you need to win any battle from that point forward. The question turns from how much damage do I deal to do I carry enough ammunition? And that's already a big relief from the bullshit that is usually occurring in Elex. In S tier, we have 3 exclusive abilities to the clerics: the Black Hole, Chain Lightning, and Mental Manacle. The Black Hole does exactly what a black hole does. Chain Lightning quickly deals with a small group of enemies, and Mental Manacle stuns enemies until they're hurt through melee combat. The difference between S tier and A tier is, for me, quite vast, and here's why. Flamethrowers are among the most broken weapons in Elex, but you can't use them while hovering in the air, and you can't quickly dodge either. Crossbows have fantastic alternate modes of fire, which includes an explosive shot and a shot that causes bleeding. The only problem of the crossbow is that you have to reload after every shot, which leaves you in a state of disadvantage. Finally, we have a cleric exclusive spell that grants 50 additional damage points to ranged weapons. In B tier, we start off with the grenade launchers that have their ammunition costs as their biggest drawback. But you have no movement limitations with them. Bows can be upgraded and still deal the highest amount of damage in Elex, but they don't cause knockback. Also, arguably in B tier are the laser rifles. They require lower stats than plasma rifles, but once again, they don't deal knockback and the overall damage is lackluster. Melee combat, if it works, is in C tier because it usually doesn't. Hand grenades are actually viable from the early to the end game, but there is no visual cue for when they explode. The Berserker spell Fireball is exactly like a flamethrower, but worse, and runs on a magic meter instead of ammunition.
I wonder which is better!
Another Berserker spell, the Poison Ball, is a fireball, but with poison. The Ice Wave is good against big enemies. Force Push and Power Waves are ALP spells, which means that they only have a timed cooldown with no additional costs. With these, you can get enemies off your back and they can have good situational use, especially in the early game. The Heavy Slug Throwers are like flamethrowers, but worse in every regard. Poisonous Aura is a Berserker spell that is a damaging melee aura. Finally, we have the Cleric Force Field. Oh my god, these names are all way too similar! Which spawns a bunch of ghostly totems that shoot enemies that stand within. D tier is significantly worse than C tier. Starting with the rocket launchers that are heavy grenade launchers but overall worse. The fire projectiles of the Berserkers don't justify their costs. The Berserker's Insect Swarm can have situational use, but just like Poison Cloud, its use is usually overshadowed by other means of attack. The ice shards, the PSI projectiles and the shotguns all have the same problems. Lackluster damage, high costs and no knockback.
You know, at this point, I feel like it's more effective to throw a goddamn box at them.
E tier features the ALP spell Drone Control, which summons a temporary companion drone which is useful in the earliest game. The camouflage spell of the Berserkers is useless because you can find an amulet that does the same. The Berserker spells Blood Transfer and Healing restore magic and health by sacrificing the other. Unfortunately, that's the only useful combo of those two spells. The Body Shield of the Elves can be useful for speedruns. The Cleric spells Phasing, Cleansing and the EMP Blast are pretty useless overall because all of them have better alternatives.
Time for the stuff that'll lead to your death by usage.
Melee combat fits wonderfully here because it usually doesn't work 50% of the time. The Flame Jet and the Ice Balls are the worst offensive Berserker spells. Summoning the lowest level wolf in the game to aid you in combat isn't helpful either, and yes, even if you upgrade your magic, it's still the same shitty wolf, but with more health. Oh, but what about Leather Skin, another Berserker spell, the effect of which is so insignificant that this spell becomes irrelevant beyond the easiest difficulty. Sensing Life does the same as a bunch of sunglasses. The item scanner of the Alps is actually useful for your very first playthrough. Technophile does nothing else but to mark mechanical enemies on your map.
Hail Kalan! Today, we are going to introduce you to our newest invention. The Holo Projector.
Why is it luring the enemies back to me?
Good news! Consequences for stealing and killing are back. Bad news, they are still on the same level of complexity as the first Gothic game. I never had any incentive to go thieving. One reason being that hunting and looting is usually worth more, and honestly, the AI behavior isn't even on the same level as Gothic 2, Gothic 3 or even Risen 1 when it comes to stealth behavior.
If you were to ask me for one last example as to why you should avoid the stealth system, check this out.
Yep, Piranha Bytes has reused the same fucking lockpicking system that they had since Risen 2 and which was already highly criticized back then. The difference this time is that your lockpicks can break.
Which makes no issue at all thanks to the overabundance of lockpicks.
Piranha Bytes also introduced hacking into Elex. Here, similar to games like Deus Ex, you input some numbers to solve small riddles. The problem is that sometimes the hacking doesn't respond to any inputs, which is kinda unnerving if you're also on a time limit. Another big issue is that your inventory interface is not only in real time, but literally exists on your arm. So sometimes you'll accidentally block sight of your own menu depending on how you simply stand. While we're at the issue, the quest log is really badly designed and always returns to one standard setting every time you exit the menu. What this means is that every time you want to check up on any side quest, you'll have to find it first, and whenever you complete a side objective, then instead of the quest log jumping to the overarching quest, it will simply show nothing instead. A very simple solution to this could have been, by the way, to just allow the player to mark multiple quests at once. This becomes a very annoying issue as Elex has hundreds of quests, and navigating the open world is a bit tedious if you realize every 30 seconds that you literally walked past another side quest objective, which means that you may need to backtrack for it. This is not exactly an issue on multiple playthroughs, but it's highly demotivating on your first one.
Speaking of issues during multiple playthroughs,
the story of Elex is a mix of Fallout's plot and Mass Effect's plot, but without any of the good features. For example, the intricate factions of Fallout are replaced by basically 4 major factions, which are all still divided into clear good and evil. Another issue is that Elex commits the sin that Mass Effect avoids with the Reaper Sovereign. I'm spoiling a bit here, but the end is extremely heavy sequel bait. And of course, the real bad guy has yet to arrive. And no, most of the main quest plot lines are never resolved in this game.
imagine if you were playing Mass Effect 1, but with the difference being that you never see or speak to the Sovereign. What that essentially means is that you have hints at its existence. It has something to do with the game's climax, but nothing beyond that. That's not a good villain to look forward to.
More bad writing. The romances you can have with 2 women, Kaja, a rogue berserker mage, and Nasty, the sister of Logan the Duke. Wouldn't you agree that these 2 scenarios could sprawl with potential? Well, don't worry. Their in-game stereotypical design seems interchangeable with the rest of the NPCs. Their storylines are flawed and cause plot holes like Nasty, the brilliant field commander, leading a fucking frontal attack against a fortress as your genius strategy.
There's nothing that can hurt us because we are going to run straight against that wall.
And finally, if their dialogue even triggers, their confession scene ends in a black screen, and once that's done, the romances are pretty much over and your chosen partner may casually address your relationship once after the final boss. The final boss itself is one of the weakest enemies in the game, and all he does is shoot with rocket launchers while generic robots try to rush you down.
And the only other boss fight is against a flying ball, which is again among the weakest enemies of Elex.
If you can kill something as weak as a raptor, then the only two bosses in the game have nothing noteworthy to throw against you, even with the reintroduction of drinking and eating animations. Every battle pretty much goes like this. Find their exploit and kill them by stun locking. Everything else is too glitchy to be used reliably.
Hey, you got some Elex?
I got everything you need.
Oh, fantastic.
The supposedly emotionless Alps constantly show bursts of emotion that should be obvious to anyone who even reads the goddamn dialogue. However, they mostly show emotions that are commonly perceived as negative feelings, but hey, let's talk about Jax. Your main protagonist is a former Alp commander, betrayed by his own brother Elex for failing a mission that didn't even really start yet. Jax survives his execution, and after a week of unconsciousness,
A whole week.
the Elex that gave him his strength is gone. Jax, as a whole, is an interesting character, but one who is underutilized and never has any awesome character moments. He even becomes borderline schizophrenic at the end of chapter 4, the end of the story. Here you can only choose certain dialogue options depending on your emotional value. Jax suddenly starts to make statements and say stuff that conflicts with earlier main quest conversations. Something that should have happened fluently, but since this game is a pure open world game, there's no sense of fluent progression or reasonable character development.
Gothic 1 and 2! But Gothic 1 and 2 were not open world focused games. The open world in those games was merely a supportive element to the actual action RPG gameplay. In Gothic 1 it was more along the lines of dungeon crawling, while in Gothic 2 it was more along the lines of following the story and discovering new areas. Nonetheless, character development still happened in Gothic 1 and 2, even though it was in small spades, admittedly. However, the character development in Elex is just suddenly there and goes again. The game doesn't really care.
As you've already probably guessed, the game is structured in 4 chapters, and at first, these chapters seem to be designed after Risen 1, but this is how the main quest and progression of the story actually works. Each chapter has one vital NPC that gives you all of your main quests, and as soon as you completed these quests for said vital NPC, then you will continue to the next chapter. However, after chapter 1, the only quests you'll receive are, once again, exclusively generic kill and fetch quests. And the great quest design of the side quests is replaced by strict linear design that may offer too, but sometimes you don't even get that much, like in the case of Rat's quest. No, wait! There are actually 2 story events in this game in which 2 supposed armies go head to head with each other. The problem is that, well, they are large-scale battles. Do I need to explain that this is an unavoidable disaster?
Time to wrap it up.
The enemy balance itself is complete ass, and even the highest level enemies give less experience points than some of the weakest monsters. Or in other words, Elex doesn't have a balance and just throws enemies of all levels into the world without really thinking about logical reasons behind it. This is even more apparent by the overuse of enemy stereotypes like wolves, and the overall enemy variation for a world that is this large is extremely lacking.
I know this is asking for much, but I need you to stick with me for a while as I explain this. Gothic 1 had what I would like to call an expanding open hub world. You know what a hub world is? A hub world is basically an overworld in which you basically only travel from point A to point B to reach the next objective or whatever it is. Usually it's the next level. In the case of Gothic 1, it's secluded dungeons like the Orc Graveyard that are slowly added to the rather big hub world, which is why it's still an open world, but not exactly. Because these additional areas are blocked off from the start, and the other areas, at least some of them, that are open from the start are later blocked off. Hence why I would like to call the world design of Gothic 1 an expanding open hub world. At least that's what my definition for that style is. Gothic 2 doesn't follow the same style. If you put it down on paper what they basically do in 2 sentences, then it's more or less the same, but it's completely different. Gothic 2's Corinne's overworld, rather, is big. It's easy to mistake it for an open world, but it's not. All of the areas, all of the expanding areas of Gothic 2 are blocked off from the very beginning. Only areas are unlocked later in the game, not locked off, unless you count chapter 6, but that's the story climax. I'm not sure you can really count that. Either way, what Gothic 2 manages to achieve is basically create a delicate balance between linear story progression and optional open world exploration. Of course, it's not always optional, like in the case of the Bandit quest, where you have to traverse through the open world and find evidence. But even that is merely a supportive element for the open world, not a focus. The story is always in its clear focus, with the open world basically only being a supportive element to enrich the gameplay experience and to enrich the storytelling through world building and more. Now the point I'm actually trying to make. Elex's open world is pure open world. Gothic 3 pure open world. That means all areas are accessible from the very beginning, and that also means that there's no balancing to speak of whatsoever. And listen, if you're an aspiring developer, please listen to me. Making a pure open world game is not an excuse not to balance anything. I'm fucking tired of it by now.
The music is good. On the other hand, the sound design is horrible, with constant rain that gets louder and quieter depending on who the fuck knows. The reload sounds, missing sounds altogether, constant sound glitches in general, and while we're at it, there are waterfalls that don't have any water.
Is this waterfall even real just because we can see it?
I know, I've been overly negative just now, but these issues need addressing. Even though I know that Piranha Bytes doesn't really care about the customer base or their feedback in general.
I'm just gonna quickly mention how Piranha Bytes didn't listen to the fans since about 2009? And they didn't have a choice back then after the release of Gothic 3, so, take your pick.
Even then, however, I can't stress enough just how much potential is inside of Piranha Bytes. But it's limited by, frankly at this point, retarded design. For every big step Elex puts forward, it takes 3 steps back again. The side quests are fantastic. The world of Magalan has enough lore to keep you engaged, even if it falls apart later. The exploration surpasses Witcher 3 and plays in the same league as Gothic 2 and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. But unlike any of those games, Elex has fundamentally broken gameplay and suffers from stupid design choices at exactly the wrong places.
Let me say this once more. Elex is not necessarily a bad game. It's a potentially great game. And if you have fun with it, then all the more power to you. Who am I to tell you differently about what you have fun with? That's not my business. But don't try to deny the fact that Elex has problems. And these are problems that are of the most amateurish fuck-ups that I've partially ever seen in a video game. The fundamental gameplay is broken. And you constantly have to play with hopes that maybe it'll work. Maybe I'm not gonna die this time because a stupid glitch kills me again. Maybe I'm not gonna die this time because the 4th hit of my axe attack doesn't fucking work. It's stuff like that. Elex, for me, is a case of I don't love it. I can see why people like it. I partially like it too. But all those flaws, I can't overlook them. Especially with how they are basically integrated into the game. And it's so obvious that so little playtesting was done that it's almost insulting to the player. And it's even worse when you consider that Piranha Bytes, again, didn't bother to patch this shit. Well, they patched a bit, but that didn't mean a whole lot.
Despite me criticizing Elex a lot in this video, I'll give Elex a 5 with a playable rating. Its strong aspects are not to be undervalued, which are the exploration and the side quests. Everything else, however, from the guilds that don't have any importance to the plot, up to the content beyond the staff credits, all of it is merely average, if not horrible in many cases. Elex is a game that is hard to recommend, and it's hard to really specify who it's for. It's not exactly for the fans of Gothic 1 and Gothic 2 to be exact. For that, the game is way too differently designed. And it's highly, highly, highly disappointing that they didn't care about playtesting enough to actually give the player a comfortable experience at least. And at this point, I'm actually pretty damn pissed. The rating of Elex all depends on your personal playing experience. It can be a 2 out of 10, it can be a 7 out of 10. But still, considering that Elex cannot even explain its systems to the player without giving him misinformation...
Take my energy, Kakarot!
Oh.